Native Americans have been living throughout the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau for more than 12,000 years. These people developed different cultures, economies, and subsistence strategies over countless generations. They relied on detailed scientific knowledge of Utah's land, weather, plants, and animals to sustain their families and communities in this arid region. During the 19th century, immigrants from Europe and America began to colonize Utah, taking away both land and vital natural resources from Native people. As Native Americans adapted to the changes wrought by settlement and industrialization, they also struggled to maintain their lands, restore their sovereignty, and secure their political rights as Americans. These efforts stretched over more than a century. In fact, Utah's indigenous people did not gain full citizenship and voting rights until 1957. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, the federal government pushed Native Americans from their homelands onto reservations, where they became wards of the state. The federal government also created assimilation programs like boarding schools for Native children, which forced them to abandon their language and culture. Native Americans served their communities and their country honorably by fighting in World War I and World War II. Still, they did not have the political rights most Americans take for granted. By the 1940s, these injustices became clear to many observers.
In fact, as late as 1945, after World War II, Native Americans had fought in the war and they were veterans and they got veterans checks, but they didn't get them because they were wards of the government. And so the government got their checks and the government put them into bank accounts for the Indians. And then the government told them when they could take money out of the bank. So they were treated like children for a very long time. But the happy end of the story is that nearly all American Indians did finally get the right to vote and the right to not be wards of the state. By 1948, American Indians in all 48 states were allowed to vote, finally. And that even included the state of Utah, because in 1940, an attorney general in Utah had looked at the law, and then he issued a legal opinion that said American Indians on reservations were residents of Utah. They could vote in 1940. And they did. They voted for the next 16 years. But then in 1956, another attorney general looked at the law again. And he said, the law was never changed. It is still written to say Native Americans can't vote if they live on a reservation. This made some Native Americans angry, as you could imagine. They'd been voting, they'd fought in the war. So a Ute Indian man named Preston Allen said, that is not right. So he went out and he hired an attorney and he went to court and he lost. He went to court again and he lost again. So then his lawyer said, we're going to appeal our case all the way to the Supreme Court. And they did. So in 1957, the state legislature of Utah says, oh, we don't want this to get to the Supreme Court because we're going to look stupid and we're going to lose because every other state allows their Native Americans to vote. And so they called a session and they made it legal by changing the way the law was written. And so that then made it officially legal in 1957 for all Native Americans to vote. Didn't matter where they lived. Sadly, this made Utah the very last state in the entire country that made it officially legal for Native Americans to vote.
Utah's Native American people had to advocate to achieve tribal sovereignty and to gain political rights as American citizens. Their history of determination and resilience is an important part of Utah's story.
By seeing how hard Utah's Native Americans have had to fight to have those rights, it helps us see how important those rights are. Those rights are not ours automatically. Sometimes we have to fight for those rights, like Native Americans had to fight and are still fighting even today. So understanding how hard we have to fight for those rights in the past, whether it was Utahns in the territory of Utah fighting to become a state, or whether it was Native Americans fighting for the right to be considered or seen as American citizens with the right to vote. That all helps us to appreciate having them. And it helps us to understand how we must be sure we don't let anyone take somebody's rights just because they look different or just because they live a little bit differently than we do. And we need to know our past in order to recognize when those rights are being taken away or are being interfered with, so we can keep it from happening now or ever again in the future.